The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the weathered general store, and Clara Mitchell pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Dust swirled in the late afternoon sun of Redemption Creek, Texas, and through the haze she could see a tall figure standing near a hitching post, hat pulled low, shoulders broad enough to block out half the storefront behind him. That had to be him. That had to be James Cordell, the rancher who had answered her advertisement, the man who had written 3 careful letters in surprisingly elegant script, the stranger who was about to become her husband. The year was 1876, and Clara had left Boston 6 days ago with nothing but 2 trunks, a carpetbag, and a secret she had not mentioned in any of her letters. She was 22 years old, an orphan since fever had taken both her parents the previous winter, and she had spent the last 8 months living with her aunt's family in circumstances that grew more unbearable by the week. Her cousin Harold had looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl, and her aunt had made it abundantly clear that Clara was a burden they could not afford to keep. So she had done what hundreds of other desperate women had done. She had placed an advertisement seeking a husband in the Western Territories, and she had accepted the first reasonable offer that came. James Cordell owned a cattle ranch 5 miles outside Redemption Creek. He was 27 years old, had never been married, and wrote that he needed a wife to help manage his household and perhaps one day raise children. He had been honest about the hardships of ranch life, the isolation, the brutal Texas heat in summer and the cold winds that swept down from the north in winter. He had not made false promises or flowery declarations. He had simply stated facts, and somehow that had reassured Clara more than any romantic words could have. The driver opened the door and helped her down, and Clara's boots touched Texas soil for the first time. The heat struck her immediately, so different from the cool spring air she had left behind in Massachusetts. Everything here was bigger and wider and more intense. The sky stretched forever in all directions, pale blue and cloudless, and the buildings along the main street looked sun-bleached and worn, as though the landscape itself was trying to erase human habitation. "Miss Mitchell?" The tall figure stepped forward, and Clara found herself looking up into a sun-weathered face with startling blue eyes. James Cordell was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and that small gesture of uncertainty made something in Clara's chest relax slightly. "Mr. Cordell," she managed, and was relieved her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "James, please," he smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines. "I hope the journey was not too difficult. It was long, but I am here now," Clara tried to return his smile, "and please call me Clara." He nodded, then seemed to remember himself and gestured to the driver, who was already unloading her trunks. "I have a wagon just there. I thought we might stay in town tonight at the boarding house. There is a judge who can marry us in the morning, if that suits you. Or we can wait a few days if you would like time to settle yourself." Clara appreciated that he was giving her a choice, but she shook her head. "Tomorrow morning would be fine. There is no reason to delay." Something flickered in his eyes, but he just nodded again and moved to help with her luggage. Clara watched him lift her heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing, muscle flexing beneath his work shirt. This was really happening. By tomorrow afternoon, she would be Clara Cordell, wife to this stranger, mistress of a ranch she had never seen. The boarding house was run by a cheerful woman named Mrs. Henderson, who showed Clara to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. James took the room across the hall, maintaining a respectful distance that Clara found both reassuring and oddly disappointing. Mrs. Henderson insisted they join her for supper, and Clara found herself sitting at a long table with James, several ranch hands, a traveling salesman, and two older gentlemen who worked at the bank. The conversation flowed around her, talk of cattle prices and weather and some dispute over water rights between neighboring ranches. James was quiet, but when he spoke the other men listened. He had an air of competence about him, of quiet authority that did not need to shout or bluster. Clara picked at her food, too nervous to eat much, and tried not to think about tomorrow. After supper, James walked her back upstairs. They paused outside her door and the hallway suddenly felt very small and intimate. "I want you to know," James said quietly, "that I will do my best to be a good husband to you, Clara. I know this is not the usual way of things, but I hope we can build something real between us." "Something that matters." Clara looked up at him, at the earnestness in those blue eyes, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "I hope so too." He reached out as though to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it and stepped back. "Sleep well. Tomorrow is an important day." Clara slipped into her room and closed the door, leaning against it as she let out a long breath. Her hands were shaking. She had been so focused on escaping Boston, on getting away from her aunt's house and Harold's wandering hands, that she had not let herself fully consider what marriage would mean. She would be tied to James Cordell for the rest of her life. She would live in his house, share his bed, bear his children if God willed it. The thought of sharing his bed made her stomach flutter with a confusing mix of anxiety and something else, something she did not have a name for. She prepared for sleep slowly, washing her face in the basin, changing into her nightgown, brushing out her long brown hair. Mrs. Henderson had left a lamp burning on the nightstand, and Clara carried it to the dresser, then reached to turn down the wick. Her hand froze. The room was small, with only one window that looked out over the dark street. Once she extinguished the lamp, it would be pitch black, completely dark. Clara's breathing quickened. Her palms began to sweat. She stood there, hand hovering over the lamp, as the familiar panic started to build in her chest. She had not slept in complete darkness since she was 8 years old. It had started the night her baby brother died. Clara had been sleeping in the nursery with him when she woke to strange sounds, gasping and choking. She had called for her mother, but by the time help came, little Thomas was gone. The doctor said it was croup, that nothing could have been done. But Clara remembered those terrible moments in the pitch-black room, hearing her brother struggle for breath and not being able to see, not being able to help, just frozen in the dark with her hands pressed over her ears. After that, she could not bear to be in a dark room. The panic would rise up and choke her, make her heart race and her skin go cold and clammy. She would see shadows moving in corners, imagine hands reaching for her. Her mother had understood and always left a candle burning. After her parents died, even her aunt had grudgingly allowed her a small lamp, though she complained about the cost of oil. But how could she explain this to James? What kind of wife was afraid of the dark like a child? He would think her weak, foolish, perhaps even mad. Clara stood there for a long moment, fighting with herself, then finally turned down the wick until the flame was very small but not extinguished. The room filled with deep shadows, but there was still a faint glow. It would have to be enough. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, watching the tiny flame flicker. Even with the light, sleep was a long time coming. Morning arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the window, and Clara dressed in her best gown, a deep blue traveling dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair, and she had to stop twice to steady herself. This was her wedding day, such as it was. James was waiting downstairs, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt, his hair still damp from washing. He looked as nervous as she felt, which somehow made her feel better. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." They walked together to the judge's office, a small building near the edge of town. Judge Morrison was a gruff man in his 60s with impressive side whiskers and a no-nonsense manner. Mrs. Henderson and her husband served as witnesses, and the whole ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Clara repeated the vows in a voice that only trembled slightly, and when James slipped a simple gold band on her finger, the weight of it felt both strange and right. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Morrison announced, and James leaned down and pressed a brief, gentle kiss to Clara's lips. It was her first kiss, and her whole body seemed to light up at the contact, brief as it was. Then it was done. She was Clara Cordell, married woman, and there was no going back. They had lunch at the boarding house. Then James helped her into the wagon for the ride out to the ranch. Clara sat beside him on the bench seat, very aware of his presence, of his hands on the reins and the warmth of his body next to hers. The landscape rolled past, empty grassland dotted with cattle in the distance, and Clara tried to memorize every detail. This was her home now, this vast open country. "The ranch is called the Double C," James said as they drove. "My father started it 20 years ago before the war. He died 3 years back and my mother passed when I was 12. I have been running it alone since then with help from my ranch hands. There are 4 of them right now. Good men, all of them. They live in the bunkhouse." "How much land do you have?" Clara asked. "About 3,000 acres, and I run around 800 head of cattle. It is not the biggest operation, but it is profitable enough. The house is not fancy, but it is solid. I have been trying to fix it up some, knowing you would be coming." Clara could hear the pride in his voice, mixed with uncertainty, and she impulsively reached over and touched his arm. "I am sure it will be wonderful." He looked at her, surprise and pleasure warming his eyes, then turned his attention back to the horses. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, and Clara's first impression was of a sturdy wooden house with a wide porch, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. It was simple but well-maintained, and there was something welcoming about it despite its isolation. Mountains rose in the blue distance, and a line of cottonwood trees suggested water nearby. "That is the creek the town is named after," James said, pointing. "It runs year-round, which is why this land is so valuable, good water and good grass." He pulled the wagon up in front of the house, and before Clara could climb down, he had come around to her side and lifted her from the seat. His hands were strong and sure on her waist, and for a moment they stood very close, his face inches from hers. "Welcome home," he said softly. Clara felt breathless. "Thank you." He carried her trunks inside, and Clara followed, looking around with keen interest. The front door opened into a main room with a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, several chairs, and a large table. To the right was a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, shelves of dishes, and a hand pump at the sink. 2 doors led off the main room, and James nodded toward them. "That one is the bedroom. The other is a small storage room, but I thought maybe you could use it for whatever you like, sewing or such." Clara moved to the bedroom doorway and looked inside. It was a good-sized room with a large bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser, a wardrobe, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. One window looked out over the front yard, and another faced east. The late afternoon sun slanted across the wooden floor. "It is lovely," Clara said, and meant it. There was something peaceful about the room, something that made her feel safe. "I will bring your things in," James said. "Take your time getting settled. I need to check on some things in the barn, but I will be back in time for supper." He left her alone, and Clara began the process of unpacking. She hung her dresses in the wardrobe, put her undergarments and stockings in the dresser, arranged her few books on the windowsill. She found a place for her mother's jewelry box, her father's pocket watch, the small daguerreotype of her family taken when Thomas was still alive. As she worked, she became aware that this was James's room too. His clothes hung in the wardrobe beside hers now. His boots sat by the door. That was his side of the bed, with the dip in the mattress where he had slept for years. Tonight they would share that bed as husband and wife, and Clara's stomach fluttered with nerves again. But beneath the nerves was something else. Anticipation, perhaps. James was kind, he was gentle, she could do much worse. She was examining the kitchen, trying to figure out where everything was kept when James returned. He washed up at the pump, and Clara tried not to watch the way his wet shirt clung to his shoulders. "I am not much of a cook," he admitted. "I have been living mostly on beans and bacon and whatever I can manage not to burn. I am hoping you might have better luck." Clara smiled. "I can cook well enough. Let me see what you have." She found potatoes, onions, a slab of bacon, eggs, flour, and canned tomatoes. Within an hour, she had produced a respectable meal of fried potatoes and bacon, scrambled eggs, and biscuits. James ate with obvious appreciation, and the compliments he paid her cooking made her feel warm with pleasure. After supper, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. James pointed out landmarks, told her about the neighboring ranches, explained his plans for expanding the herd. Clara listened and asked questions, and slowly the conversation began to flow more naturally. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's stern but fair nature, about his mother who had loved music and tried to bring culture to the wilderness. Clara told him about Boston, about her parents, about her love of reading and her skill with a needle. She did not tell him about Thomas or about the darkness. As the light faded and stars began to appear, James stood and offered his hand. "It has been a long day. We should probably get some rest." Clara's heart began to hammer again. She took his hand and let him lead her inside, let him light the lamp in the bedroom, let him close the door behind them. They stood there in the lamplight, suddenly awkward with each other again. "Clara," James said quietly, "I want you to know that I will not rush you. I know this is all very new, and I do not want you to be frightened of me." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you." "That is kind of you. We have the rest of our lives to figure things out," he smiled. "No need to hurry." He turned away to give her privacy, and Clara quickly changed into her nightgown. When she cleared her throat to let him know she was ready, he turned back, and she saw his eyes darken as he looked at her. But he only moved to the other side of the bed and began to remove his boots and shirt. Clara climbed under the covers and tried not to stare at his bare chest, at the muscles that moved beneath tanned skin. He caught her looking and smiled slightly, and she blushed and looked away. He left his trousers on and climbed in beside her, and suddenly the bed that had seemed large enough felt very small. Clara could feel the heat of his body, could hear his breathing. "Good night, Clara," he said softly. "Good night." She waited until she heard his breathing even out, then carefully reached over and turned down the lamp. Darkness crashed over her like a wave. Panic seized her chest. The room was completely black, no moonlight coming through the windows yet, just absolute darkness pressing in from all sides. Clara's heart raced. Her breathing came in short gasps. She could feel the darkness moving, reaching for her, and she wanted to scream but could not make a sound. She must have made some noise, though, because James stirred beside her. "Clara, are you all right?" She could not answer, could not breathe. Her hands clutched the quilt so tightly her fingers ached. "Clara," his voice was more urgent now, and she felt the bed move as he sat up. "What is wrong?" "The light," she managed to gasp. "Please, the light." She heard the scratch of a match, and then blessed warm light bloomed as James lit the lamp. He turned to her immediately, concern etched on his face. "Are you ill?" "Should I fetch a doctor?" Clara shook her head, humiliation flooding through her now that she could see again. "No, I am sorry, I am so sorry." "Sorry for what? Tell me what is wrong." She could not look at him. "I cannot sleep in the dark. I know it is foolish and childish, but I cannot. I am too afraid." There was a long silence, and Clara braced herself for mockery or anger. Instead, James's voice was gentle. "How long has this been true?" "Since I was 8 years old." The words came out in a rush now. "My baby brother died in the night, and I was there in the dark with him, and I could not see, could not help, and ever since I cannot bear it. I have to have a light. I should have told you before, but I was afraid you would think me weak or mad, and I am sorry, I am so sorry." She was crying now, hot tears of shame sliding down her cheeks. What kind of wife was she? What man wanted to be married to someone so broken? James was quiet for a moment, and then she felt his hand, warm and gentle, touching her face, wiping away her tears. "Look at me, Clara." She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see disappointment or disgust. Instead, she saw only compassion. "You are not weak, and you are not mad. You suffered something terrible, and it left a mark. That does not make you less." His thumb stroked her cheek softly. "I will leave the lamp on, every night for as long as you need." "It is such a small thing, Clara. Do not cry over it. You do not mind." "Mind? No, how could I mind?" He smiled. "I would rather have a wife who needs a lamp burning than sleep alone in the dark. That is no hardship at all." The relief was so intense Clara started crying harder, and James made a soft sound and pulled her against his chest, his arms coming around her. She pressed her face against his bare skin and let herself weep, let out all the fear and shame and loneliness of the last months, and he just held her and stroked her hair and murmured soft words she could not quite hear, but that soothed her anyway. When she finally quieted, she realized she was essentially lying on top of him, and she started to pull away, but his arms tightened. "Stay," he said quietly, "if you want to." Clara hesitated, then relaxed against him. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, and the warmth of his skin was comforting. She felt safe, safer than she had felt in a very long time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for not making me feel foolish. You could never be foolish to me." His hand continued to stroke her hair, and Clara felt herself growing drowsy. "Sleep now, I have you. Nothing will hurt you here." And with the lamp burning softly on the nightstand, wrapped in her husband's arms, Clara finally slept. She woke to bright sunlight and the smell of coffee. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, then memory flooded back. The ranch, Texas, James. She sat up quickly and saw that she was alone in the bed, the covers tucked carefully around her. The lamp on the nightstand was extinguished now, the morning light making it unnecessary. She could hear sounds from the kitchen, the clank of pans and the crackle of fire. Clara rose and dressed quickly, twisting her hair into a simple knot, then ventured out to find James at the stove, frowning down at a pan of eggs that appeared to be burning. "Let me," she said, and he stepped aside with obvious relief. She saved what she could of the eggs, made fresh coffee, sliced bread for toasting. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself stealing glances at her husband. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes, and she realized he probably had not slept well with the lamp burning. "Did the light keep you awake?" she asked. He shrugged. "I will get used to it." "It is not a problem." But guilt needled at her anyway. It was not fair to him, having to sleep with a lamp burning just because his wife was frightened of shadows. After breakfast, James took her on a tour of the ranch. He showed her the barn with its stalls for the horses, the henhouse where chickens scratched in the dirt, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. He introduced her to the men. Tom, a grizzled older cowboy with a limp from an old injury, Pete, a young man barely 20 with a quick smile, Diego, quiet and competent with a rope, and Sam, who served as foreman and had steady eyes and a firm handshake. All of them greeted her respectfully, and Clara could see curiosity in their faces, but also a certain wariness, as though they were not sure what to make of having a woman on the ranch. James showed her the cattle grazing on the hillsides, explained about spring calving and fall roundups, talked about the work that needed to be done. Clara listened and tried to absorb it all, this new world she had entered. "I know it is a lot," James said as they walked back toward the house, "but you will learn. And you do not have to do ranch work if you do not want to. Managing the house is job enough." "I want to help," Clara said. "I want to be useful, not just another mouth to feed." He stopped and turned to face her. "You are my wife, Clara. You are not here to earn your keep. You are here because I want you here." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "I want to be here too," she said softly. Something flared in his eyes, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But then one of the hands called his name, something about a fence that needed mending, and the moment passed. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Clara woke early and made breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, which had been sadly neglected. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs, and slowly brought order to the chaos. She discovered that James had a surprising number of books, and she arranged them carefully on a shelf he built for her. In the afternoons, she worked in the garden plot behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Texas soil, and she began to get to know the chickens and which ones were the best layers. James worked from dawn to dusk, riding out with his men to check the herds, mend fences, doctor sick cattle, break horses. He came home tired and dusty and hungry, and Clara made sure there was always a good meal waiting. She learned to cook beans the way he liked them, to make cornbread that did not crumble, to fry steaks from the beef they kept in the cold cellar. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch or by the fire, and slowly they learned each other. James told her stories about the ranch, about cattle drives and stampedes, about the time a mountain lion had killed 3 calves in 1 week and he had hunted it for days. Clara told him about her childhood in Boston, about the books she loved, about her dreams of adventure that had led her west. And every night, without comment or complaint, James left the lamp burning as they climbed into bed. They had not yet consummated their marriage. James seemed content to wait, to let Clara grow comfortable with him, and she was grateful for his patience even as she began to wonder what it would be like. She found herself noticing him more and more, the way his hands looked gripping the reins, the breadth of his shoulders, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. When he kissed her good night, brief, chaste kisses that made her want more, she felt heat pool low in her belly. She was falling in love with him, she realized one morning as she watched him ride out toward the range. It had been gradual, built from small kindnesses and quiet conversations and the safety of his steady presence. He made her laugh. He listened when she talked. He treated her like she mattered, like her thoughts and opinions were valuable, and he had never once made her feel ashamed of needing the lamp. 3 weeks after her arrival, Clara was in the henhouse gathering eggs when she heard raised voices from the yard. She emerged to find James facing 3 men on horseback, strangers with hard faces and guns on their hips. "I am telling you the price is more than fair," one of them was saying. He was a big man with a thick beard and mean eyes. "Mr. Garrett wants this water access, and he is willing to pay." "And I am telling you it is not for sale," James replied, his voice level but his hand resting on his own pistol. "The creek runs through my land, and it will continue to do so. Garrett does not like being told no. Then Garrett will have to learn to live with disappointment." The bearded man leaned forward in his saddle. "You are making a mistake, Cordell. A man alone out here, accidents can happen." "I am not alone," James's voice was cold now. "And if Garrett or any of his men set foot on my land again without invitation, they will find out exactly how unfriendly I can be. Now get out." The men stared at him for a long moment, and Clara's heart hammered with fear. There were 3 of them and only one of James. But finally, the bearded man spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse around. "You will regret this," he called back as they rode away. James watched until they were out of sight, then turned and saw Clara standing by the henhouse. His expression softened immediately. "How much did you hear?" "Enough. Who is Garrett?" "Neighboring rancher. He owns the land to the south, and he has been wanting access to the creek for years. My father refused to sell, and so do I." James walked over to her. "I did not mean to frighten you." "I am not frightened," Clara lied, "but those men seem dangerous. They work for Garrett, and yes, they are dangerous, but so am I when I need to be." He touched her face gently. "I will not let anyone hurt you, Clara, I promise you that." She believed him, but the encounter left her uneasy. That night, she found herself clinging to James a little tighter as they lay in bed, and his arms came around her without question. "Tell me something happy," she said into the darkness that was not quite darkness with the lamp still burning. "Something happy," he thought for a moment. "When I was a boy, my mother used to take me down to the creek in summer. She would tuck her skirts up and wade in, and we would catch crawfish with our bare hands. My father thought she was scandalous, wading around like a child, but she just laughed. She had the best laugh." Clara smiled. "She sounds wonderful." She was. "She made this place feel like home, not just a ranch." His hand stroked her hair. "You do that too, you know, make it feel like home again." Her throat tightened with emotion. "I am glad." They lay in silence for a while, and Clara listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong. She felt his breathing slow as he started to fall asleep, felt his arms relax around her. "James." She whispered, "MMM. I think I am falling in love with you." His arms tightened again, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Good," he murmured. "Because I fell in love with you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and looked at me like I might not be the worst mistake you had ever made." Clara's heart felt so full she thought it might burst. She tilted her face up, and in the lamplight she could see his eyes, warm and deep. She leaned up and kissed him, not the chaste goodnight kisses they had been sharing, but a real kiss, deep and searching. James made a low sound in his throat and rolled, pulling her beneath him, his weight pressing her into the mattress. The kiss went on, and Clara felt like she was burning up, like every nerve in her body had come alive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Clara, if we keep going, I will not want to stop." "Then do not stop," she whispered. His eyes searched hers. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. I want this. I want you." What followed was awkward and tender and occasionally fumbling, but also utterly perfect. James was gentle and patient, guiding her through her fear and uncertainty, and when there was pain, he soothed her and waited until it passed. And after, when they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Clara felt changed in some fundamental way. She was truly his wife now, and he was truly her husband, and the bond between them felt unbreakable. "Are you all right?" James asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I am better than all right. That was wonderful," he laughed softly. "I am glad you think so. We can improve with practice." "I like the sound of that." Clara snuggled closer to him. "James, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I love you. Not just falling. I love you completely. I think perhaps I was waiting my whole life to find you. I just did not know it." His arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I love you too, Clara, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." They kissed again, slowly and sweetly, and Clara felt peace settle over her like a blanket. She was home, truly home. The summer heat intensified as June gave way to July, and Clara learned what James had meant about brutal Texas weather. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the grassland brown and making the air shimmer with heat. She worked in the early mornings and late evenings, staying inside during the worst of the afternoon heat. and she learned to appreciate the thick walls of the house that kept the interior relatively cool. James and his men worked from before dawn until after dark, making sure the cattle had access to water, moving them to areas where the grass was still green. He came home exhausted and sunburned, and Clara made sure he drank enough water and ate enough food. On the hottest nights they slept with the windows open, and the lamp turned very low, and Clara found that she could tolerate the dimness as long as there was some light. In early August, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. James went to meet them, and Clara watched from the porch as he spoke with a man on a magnificent black horse. The conversation seemed intense, with much gesturing toward the creek, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with worry. When the riders finally left and James returned to the house, his face was grim. "That was Garrett himself," he said. "He is not pleased that I refused his men. He is threatening to file a claim that his property line actually extends to include part of the creek." "Can he do that?" "He can try. He has money and lawyers, and I have the original deed my father bought 20 years ago. It will come down to who the judge believes." James ran a hand through his hair. "I may need to go to Austin, present our case. It could take weeks." Clara's heart sank. "When would you leave?" "Not until after the roundup in September." "I cannot leave the ranch during the busiest season." He pulled her into his arms. "I do not want to go. The thought of being away from you is unbearable." "Then I will come with you." He pulled back to look at her. "To Austin, Clara, it is a long journey and the city is rough." "I do not care. We are married, James. Where you go, I go." He studied her face, then smiled. "All right. If the trip becomes necessary, we will go together." But before any trip to Austin could be arranged, disaster struck. Clara was hanging laundry on a warm September morning when she saw smoke rising from the southern pasture. She called for James, who was working in the barn, and he emerged, took one look, and cursed. "Fire," he said shortly. "Sam, Tom, Pete, Diego with me. Clara, get inside and stay there." He ran for his horse, and the other men were already mounting up, grabbing shovels and blankets. Clara ignored his order and ran to the henhouse, releasing the chickens from the enclosed yard so they could flee if needed. She filled every bucket and tub she could find with water from the pump, just in case. The smoke grew thicker, and she could see flames now, an orange line moving across the grassland. The wind was blowing from the south, pushing the fire toward the ranch buildings. Clara did the only thing she could think of. She soaked blankets in water and draped them over the sides of the house and barn. She filled more buckets. She watched the horizon and prayed. It took hours, but finally the smoke began to thin. The wind shifted, and the flames turned away from the buildings, burning east instead. By the time the sun set, the fire was out, and James and his men rode back, blackened with soot and smoke, exhausted but alive. Clara ran to James as he dismounted, and he caught her in his arms. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, checking him for injuries. "Just tired. We got it stopped before it reached the buildings." He looked down at the water-soaked blankets, at the buckets and tubs she had prepared. "You did well, Clara, very well." "How did it start?" His face darkened. "Someone set it deliberately." "We found the remains of a torch." Clara felt cold despite the heat. "Garrett. Most likely his men, but yes, they are trying to scare me into selling or drive me off the land entirely." He looked at the burned grassland, at the blackened earth that stretched for acres. "We lost a lot of grazing land. It will take years to come back fully. What are we going to do?" James's jaw tightened. "We are going to Austin as soon as the herd is settled. We are going to see the territorial judge and make sure my claim is protected by law. And then I am going to make very clear to Garrett that attacking my land means war." They left for Austin 2 weeks later, leaving Sam in charge of the ranch. The journey took 3 days by stagecoach, and Clara spent the time watching the landscape change, the dry grasslands giving way to rolling hills, and then to the outskirts of the city. Austin was bigger and louder and more chaotic than Clara had expected. The streets were crowded with wagons and horses and people, and the noise was overwhelming after the quiet of the ranch. James secured them a room at a respectable hotel, and the next morning they went to the courthouse to file their claim. The process was tedious and bureaucratic. They had to present their deed, sign affidavits, pay fees, and wait for a hearing date. The judge assigned to their case was not available for 2 weeks, which meant they were stuck in Austin. James fretted about being away from the ranch, but Clara did her best to distract him. They explored the city, visited the markets, attended a concert at a theater that made Clara feel like she was back in Boston. In their hotel room at night, James made love to her with a fierce intensity that spoke to his worry and frustration, and Clara held him and soothed him as best she could. The hearing finally took place on a gray October morning. Garrett was there with his lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who argued that the original survey had been incorrect and that the creek actually fell within Garrett's property boundaries. James presented their deed and a letter from the original surveyor, now deceased, that clearly stated the landmarks used. The judge, an older man with shrewd eyes, listened to both sides and then asked pointed questions. He seemed unimpressed by Garrett's lawyer and interested in the historical documents James provided. After deliberating, he ruled in James's favor. The property lines were as stated in the original deed, and the creek belonged to the Double C Ranch. Garrett's face turned purple with rage and he stormed out of the courtroom. His lawyer followed, muttering about appeals, but for now they had won. That night, Clara and James celebrated with dinner at the finest restaurant in Austin. James was relaxed for the first time in weeks, smiling and laughing, and Clara felt her heart swell with love for him. When they returned to their room, he picked her up and spun her around, kissing her soundly. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." "You did it," Clara corrected. "I just came along for the ride. You are my partner, Clara, in all things. I could not have done this without you." They made love slowly that night, savoring each other, and afterward Clara lay in James's arms and felt utterly content. The lamp on the nightstand burned steadily, but she barely noticed it anymore. It was just part of their routine, as natural as breathing. They returned to the ranch to find that everything had run smoothly in their absence. The cattle were healthy, the hands had kept up with the work, and there had been no more attacks from Garrett's men. It seemed the legal victory had convinced Garrett to back off, at least for now. Winter came, and with it cold winds and frost that killed the last of the garden plants. Clara spent more time indoors, sewing and raiding and learning to make the heavy stews and soups that would sustain them through the coldest months. James taught her to play chess, and they spent long evenings by the fire, moving pieces across the board and talking about everything and nothing. On Christmas Eve, James presented her with a gift, a beautiful shawl in deep red that he had ordered from a catalog. Clara gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, with careful stitches and mother-of-pearl buttons she had bought in Austin. They sat by the fire and sang carols, and Clara felt happier than she had ever been in her life. In January, Clara realized she had not had her monthly courses since before they went to Austin. She waited another week to be sure, then told James as they were getting ready for bed. He went very still. "Are you certain as I can be? I think I am going to have a baby, James." He let out a whoop and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Clara, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" "Happy, I am over the moon," he kissed her deeply. "You have made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring. Clara suffered some morning sickness but nothing unbearable, and by April she was beginning to show. James fussed over her constantly, not wanting her to do any heavy work, and the ranch hands treated her like she was made of glass. She bore it all with good humor, secretly pleased by their concern. In May, as Clara's belly grew round and full, Garrett made one final attempt to cause trouble. His men cut the fence along the southern boundary and drove 200 head of his cattle onto double C land, letting them graze on James's grass and drink from his creek. James and his men drove the cattle back and repaired the fence, but the next day it was cut again. This time, James rode directly to Garrett's ranch with Sam and Tom backing him up. Clara did not hear exactly what was said, but James returned with bruised knuckles and a grim satisfaction. The fence was not cut again. Whatever message James had delivered, it had been received. "Did you fight him?" Clara asked, dabbing at his split knuckles with a damp cloth. "He took a swing at me. I defended myself." James smiled slightly. "He is getting too old for brawling." "I think I may have knocked some sense into him. James Cordell, you are going to be a father. You cannot go around getting into fistfights. Then men need to stop picking fights with me." He pulled her close, his hand settling on her swollen belly. "I would fight the whole territory to protect you and this baby, Clara. Do not ever doubt that." The baby came in late July, during the height of the summer heat. Clara went into labor in the morning, and James immediately sent Pete for the midwife in town, a capable woman named Mrs. Cooper. The labor was long and difficult, lasting into the night, and James paced the main room like a caged animal, listening to Clara cry out in pain and feeling utterly helpless. Finally, near midnight, Clara heard the thin wail of a baby, and Mrs. Cooper emerged from the bedroom with a small bundle. "You have a son, Mr. Cordell, a big healthy boy." James took the baby with shaking hands, staring down at the tiny red face, the small fists waving in the air. "A son," he breathed. "Your wife wants to see you both," Mrs. Cooper said gently. James carried the baby into the bedroom, where Clara lay exhausted and pale but smiling. He placed the baby in her arms and sat beside her on the bed. "He is beautiful," Clara whispered, tracing a finger over the baby's soft cheek. "He looks like you. He is perfect. You are perfect." James kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you for giving me a family." They named the baby Thomas after Clara's brother, and he became the center of their world. James proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Clara for nursing, changing diapers without complaint, singing to his son in a surprisingly good voice. Clara watched her husband cradle their son and fell in love with him all over again. Thomas was 6 months old when Clara realized she was pregnant again. This time there was no surprise, just quiet happiness as they welcomed the news. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, arrived the following summer, smaller than her brother but with a set of lungs that could wake the whole ranch. The years flowed past, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. The cattle herd grew. James bought more land from a neighbor looking to sell. They added rooms to the house as the children grew. Pete married a girl from town and built a small house near the bunkhouse. Sam became more friend than employee, eating Sunday dinners with the family and teaching Thomas to ride. Clara never did overcome her fear of the dark completely, but it no longer ruled her life. With James beside her and the lamp burning low, she could sleep peacefully. Sometimes she even forgot it was there, so accustomed had she become to the routine. When Thomas was 4 and Rose was 2, Clara gave birth to another daughter, Elizabeth. And 2 years after that, twin boys arrived, Henry and William, much to everyone's surprise and James's delight. The house was chaos with 5 children running about, but it was a happy chaos. Clara managed the household with efficient grace, and James balanced his ranch work with being a present father. He taught the boys to rope and ride, and he taught the girls too, despite some raised eyebrows from more traditional neighbors. He told stories by the fire on winter evenings, held babies while Clara cooked, and never complained about the noise and mess that came with a large family. On their 10th anniversary, James took Clara back to Austin for a week, leaving the children in the capable hands of Sam's wife Maria, who had become Clara's closest friend. They stayed in the same hotel, went to the theater, and walked through the city like young lovers. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked one evening as they strolled along the river. "Leaving Boston, coming west to marry a stranger." Clara looked up at him, at the face she knew as well as her own now, the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the silver starting to thread through his dark hair. She thought about the frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago, desperate and alone. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and capable and loved. "Not for one single moment," she said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, James Cordell." He pulled her close and kissed her right there on the riverbank, not caring who saw. "And you are mine, Clara. You always will be." They returned to the ranch to find that Thomas had taught Rose to climb trees, and Elizabeth had somehow managed to get into the flower bin, and the twins had decorated the henhouse with mud. But everyone was safe and healthy, and the house felt warm and alive with the sound of children's laughter. Years continued to pass. Thomas grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and looks. Rose proved to be fearless, always ready for adventure. Elizabeth was gentle and bookish, while Henry and William were inseparable troublemakers. Clara taught them all to read and write, to cipher and do sums. James taught them the ways of the ranch, the value of hard work, the importance of treating animals and people with respect. Garrett died when Thomas was 12, and his ranch was divided among his children who had no interest in feuding with their neighbors. The water dispute was finally, permanently settled. The years were not without hardship. There were droughts that dried up pastures and forced them to sell cattle at a loss. There were harsh winters when they worried about the children getting sick. There was the year Rose fell from her horse and broke her arm, and the terrible week when the twins both had scarlet fever and Clara and James took turns sitting up with them, afraid they might die. But they weathered every storm together, leaning on each other, on their love, on the life they had built. When Clara was 35 and James was 40, they welcomed their last child, a daughter they named Grace. She was an unexpected blessing, arriving 13 years after the twins, and she was doted on by her older siblings. Thomas was 19 by then, running more of the ranch operations as James began to slow down slightly. He had his eye on a girl in town, the banker's daughter, and James gave him advice on courting that made Clara laugh until she cried. Rose at 17 was beautiful and bold, attracting suitors but dismissing them all as boring. Elizabeth was bookish and sweet at 15, always with her nose in a novel. Henry and William at 13 were still getting into trouble, though they worked hard when they had to. And little Grace toddled around the house, bringing joy and chaos in equal measure. One autumn evening, when the children were all in bed and the house was finally quiet, Clara and James sat on the porch watching the sun set. James held her hand, his thumb rubbing absently over her wedding ring still on her finger after all these years. "Do you remember the first night?" Clara asked. "When I could not sleep in the dark and you said you would leave the lamp on." "I remember," James said. "You were so frightened I would have promised you anything." "You kept that promise." "Every single night for 20 years now." "It was never a burden, Clara, not once." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light she could see the love in his eyes, as strong as it had been that first night. "I told you I would leave the lamp on, and I meant it. I will keep it burning as long as you need me to, for the rest of our lives if necessary." Clara leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders. She thought about the girl she had been, terrified of the dark, afraid of her own shadow. She thought about the woman she had become, mother to 6 children, partner to this good man, mistress of a thriving ranch. She was not afraid anymore, or at least not in the same way. There were still nights when the shadows seemed too deep, when old memories rose up. But she had James, solid and steady beside her, and she had the lamp, and she had the knowledge that she was loved beyond measure. "I love you," she said quietly, "more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too. You are my heart, Clara. You always have been." They sat there as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, the lamp in their bedroom burned softly, a beacon of safety and love. It would burn through the night as it had every night for 20 years, as it would for all the nights to come. Clara had crossed a continent to marry a stranger, driven by desperation and hope. She had found instead a partner, a lover, a friend. She had found home. And she had learned that sometimes the smallest gesture, a lamp left burning in the darkness, could mean everything. It could mean safety and acceptance. It could mean love that did not judge or demand, but simply offered comfort. It could mean a promise kept, day after day, night after night, through all the seasons of a life built together. The lamp still burned in their bedroom when they finally went inside, and it would burn still when morning came, a small golden light against the darkness, constant and true. Thomas married the banker's daughter when he was 21, and they built a house on the eastern section of the Double C, expanding the ranch into a true family enterprise. He and his wife Emily had 3 children in quick succession, making Clara and James grandparents. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a circuit preacher who came through Redemption Creek. She married him at 19 and traveled with him throughout Texas, helping establish churches in small towns. She wrote long letters home filled with stories of her adventures, and Clara smiled every time one arrived, seeing so much of her daughter's fierce spirit in every word. Elizabeth became a schoolteacher in town, educating the children of Redemption Creek with patience and creativity. She married at 22, a quiet man who owned the general store, and they had 2 daughters who were as bookish as their mother. Henry and William, inseparable as always, went north for a few years to learn ranching techniques in Montana. They returned when they were 21 with new ideas and innovations that helped the Double C continue to thrive. They both married within a year of each other, local girls they had known since childhood, and their families remained close. Grace grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's kindness and her father's strength. She was Clara's constant companion as the other children grew up and moved on with their lives. On Clara's 45th birthday, James gave her a gift that made her weep. It was a bound journal, and on the first page he had written, "The story of how a frightened girl from Boston became the woman I could not live without." Inside, he had filled pages with his own handwriting, documenting their life together, the day she arrived, their wedding, the first night she told him about the darkness. Every milestone with the children, the challenges they had faced and overcome, the small moments that had made up the fabric of their life. "You did this?" Clara asked, tears streaming down her face. "You wrote all of this?" "Every word," James said. "I wanted you to know how I see our life, how precious every moment with you has been. I wanted our children and grandchildren to know the story of how we built this family." Clara threw her arms around him and held on tight, this man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and loved her anyway, who had kept his promise for 25 years now, who had given her a life beyond anything she had ever dreamed. That night, as they lay in bed with the lamp burning softly, Clara read through the journal, laughing and crying at James's memories, at the love that radiated from every page. "You are going to make me vain," she said, setting the journal aside. "All these pages about how wonderful I am. You are wonderful, the most wonderful woman I have ever known. James pulled her close. "Do you know what my favorite thing is, Clara, after all these years?" "What?" "That I still get to wake up next to you every morning. That I still get to hold you every night. That we built this life, this family, this home together." He kissed her softly. "I would do it all again, exactly the same, just to end up here with you." Clara kissed him back, pouring all her love into it. They had been married for 25 years, but the passion between them had never dimmed. If anything, it had grown deeper, richer, tempered by time and trust and profound understanding. They made love with the easy familiarity of long practice, knowing exactly how to please each other, and afterward, Clara lay in James's arms and felt at peace with the world. The years continued their steady march. James's hair went completely silver, and Clara found lines around her eyes and mouth that had not been there before. But they were still strong, still active, still running the ranch with help from Thomas and the twins. Grace married at 22, a young lawyer from Austin who had come to Redemption Creek to practice. Clara and James gave them a piece of land on the western edge of the ranch, and soon another house rose there, another branch of the family tree. Grandchildren multiplied. Clara lost count somewhere around 15, and James laughed and said it did not matter as long as they loved them all. Sunday dinners became enormous affairs, with 3 generations crowding around tables both inside and out on the porch, the air filled with conversation and laughter and the sounds of children playing. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the main house for a celebration. Thomas gave a speech, his voice breaking with emotion as he talked about his parents' love and the example they had set. Rose traveled from across Texas to be there, bringing her now-grown children. All of their children spoke, sharing memories and love, and by the end, Clara and James were both crying. 40 years, James said to Clara that night as they finally escaped to the quiet of their bedroom. "How did we get so lucky?" "I do not think it was luck," Clara said. "I think it was a choice we made every day, to love each other, to honor our promises, to build something that would last." "Well, I choose you, today and every day," he kissed her. "And I will keep choosing you until the day I die." The lamp burned on the nightstand as it had for 40 years, and Clara reached out and touched it gently. "I do not think I need this anymore," she said quietly. James looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean I am not afraid of the dark anymore." "I have not been, not really, for a long time. I have you, I have our family, I have a life filled with light." She smiled at him. "You can turn it off if you want to." He studied her face carefully. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." James reached out and turned down the wick, and the lamp went dark. The room was not completely black, though. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting silver shadows across the floor. Clara could see James's face, could see the love in his eyes. "How does it feel?" he asked softly. Clara considered. There was no panic, no fear, just peace. Just James beside her and the knowledge that she was safe. "It feels like freedom," she said. They lay down together in the moonlit darkness, and Clara felt something deep inside her finally, completely heal. The little girl who had listened to her brother die in the dark was gone. The frightened woman who had needed a lamp burning just to sleep was gone. In their place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that love was its own kind of light, that safety came not from lamps but from the person holding you in the darkness. "Thank you," Clara whispered, "for keeping your promise all these years, for never making me feel ashamed, for loving me exactly as I was." "Thank you for letting me," James replied. "For trusting me with your fear, for building this life with me." They fell asleep in each other's arms in the natural darkness of night, and Clara slept peacefully straight through until morning. From that night on, they no longer needed the lamp. But James kept it on the nightstand anyway, filled and ready just in case, because that was who he was. A man who kept his promises, who honored his wife's needs, who would always make sure she felt safe. They had many more years together. They grew old side by side, their children and grandchildren surrounding them with love. James developed arthritis in his hands that made ranch work difficult, but he still went out every day, still checked on the cattle, still felt most alive on horseback with the Texas sky overhead. Clara's hands grew spotted with age, but they were still clever with a needle, still capable in the kitchen, still gentle when touching her husband's face. When James was 70 and Clara was 67, he had a stroke that left him weak on one side. For terrible days the family gathered, unsure if he would survive. But Clara sat beside his bed, holding his hand, talking to him in a steady stream of memories and love, and slowly, gradually, he came back to them. He never fully recovered, needing a cane to walk and struggling with words sometimes. But his mind was sharp and his love was undiminished. Clara cared for him with tireless devotion, helping him dress, cutting his food, supporting him when he walked. "You do not have to do this," he told her one afternoon, frustrated with his own weakness. "You could hire someone." "Do not be ridiculous," Clara said firmly. "You took care of me for 40 years. You left the lamp burning every single night, never once complaining. You think I would not do the same for you? We are partners, James, in everything, until the end." He pulled her down for a kiss, and she could feel his tears on her face. They had 3 more good years. James recovered enough strength to get around with his cane, to sit on the porch and watch his grandchildren play, to hold his great-grandchildren and tell them stories about the old days. He and Clara celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by a family that had grown to include children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. 4 generations of love that had started with a mail-order bride and a cowboy who promised to leave the lamp on. James died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night with Clara beside him. She woke at dawn to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. She did not cry at first. She just lay there, memorizing his face one last time, grateful beyond words for the 50 years they had shared. At his funeral, Clara stood straight and dry-eyed while her children wept. She knew James would not want her to fall apart. He would want her to be strong, to continue living, to find joy in the family they had created. After the funeral, Thomas tried to convince her to move in with him and Emily, but Clara refused. "This is my home," she said. "Your father and I built it together. I am not leaving." So she stayed in the house on the Double C, with Grace and her family nearby, with Thomas checking on her daily, with a steady stream of grandchildren and great-grandchildren keeping her company. She kept busy, sewing quilts for new babies, tending her garden, teaching the youngest generation to read. But at night, alone in the big bed, she struggled. Not with the darkness, but with the absence. She missed James with an ache that never quite went away, missed his voice, his laugh, the warmth of his body beside hers. Missed the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he would pull her close in his sleep. One evening, about 6 months after James died, Clara was preparing for bed when she noticed the lamp on the nightstand. She had not lit it since James's death, preferring the darkness that she no longer feared. But tonight, on impulse, she lit the wick and turned it up. The familiar golden glow filled the room, and suddenly Clara could feel James's presence so strongly, it took her breath away. She could almost see him, leaning against the dresser with that slight smile, asking if she was coming to bed. Could almost hear his voice saying, "I will leave the lamp on." Tears streamed down her face as she climbed into bed, and for the first time since his death, she let herself truly grieve. She cried for the years they had lost, for the conversations they would never have, for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren he would not see grow up. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she lay in the lamplight and felt, finally, a measure of peace. She kept the lamp burning after that. Not because she needed it, but because it reminded her of James, of his kindness, of his unending love. It became a memorial of sorts, a promise kept even though he was gone. Clara lived for 8 more years, until she was 75 years old. She remained sharp and active until the very end, a matriarch presiding over a family that had grown to over 60 members. She taught her great-great-grandchildren to bake bread, told them stories about the early days of the ranch, about how the West had been tamed not just by cowboys and cattle, but by families who loved each other and worked together. She died on a warm summer evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, a great-grandchild on her lap. One moment she was pointing out a hawk circling overhead, and the next she was gone, slipping away as gently as a sigh. They buried her next to James on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under the endless Texas sky. The entire family came, and the procession stretched from the house to the cemetery, a testament to the life Clara and James had built together. That night, after everyone had gone home, Thomas walked up to the main house alone. He went into his parents' bedroom and looked at the lamp on the nightstand, the lamp that had burned for 50 years to keep his mother safe, the lamp she had kept burning for 8 more years as a memorial to his father. He lit it one last time and sat in the darkness, letting the golden glow wash over him, remembering his father teaching him to rope, his mother singing while she cooked. The way they looked at each other, even after decades of marriage, still so clearly in love. Then he gently turned down the wick and let the lamp go dark. His parents did not need it anymore. They were together again, wherever they were, and he had to believe that Clara was no longer afraid of any darkness, because James was there with her, as he had always been, as he always would be. The lamp stayed on the nightstand, though, passed down through generations as a family heirloom. It became a symbol of the love that had founded the Double C, of promises kept and compassion shown. Every bride who married into the family heard the story of the mail-order bride who was afraid of the dark, and the cowboy who said, "I will leave the lamp on." And in those words, in that simple act of kindness, they heard what love truly meant. It meant seeing someone's vulnerability and protecting it. It meant making space for fear without judgment. It meant keeping promises day after day, year after year, until they became the foundation of a life. It meant that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean everything. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, the family Clara and James built spreading across Texas and beyond. But no matter how far they traveled or how much the world changed, they carried that story with them, that reminder of what real love looked like. A girl from Boston and a cowboy from Texas. A mail-order bride and the man who took a chance on her. 2 strangers who became partners, then lovers, then the foundation of something that would last far beyond their own lives. All because he saw her fear and did not turn away. All because he promised to leave the lamp on and then kept that promise for the rest of his days. That was the kind of love that changed lives. That was the kind of love that built legacies. That was the kind of love that lasted forever, even when the lamp finally went dark.